Yeah, let's see. Awesome. Awesome. Oh, and how do I say your first name? I want to make sure. Or how do I say your name just in general, both? Make sure you.
Baljinder Sadra.
Baljinder Sadra. Sadra.
It's pronounced exactly how it's spelled.
Okay. Okay. I was just making sure. Names are very important to me.
That's fine, of course. Of
Awesome.
course.
So
Yeah.
the paper we're going over is the compassion balance. And so yeah, how would you kind of summarize the kind of results and the kind of rationale behind the paper?
Certainly. When we began to work on this project, we saw that in the literature on compassion, in the scientific literature on compassion, there were a lot of findings where people were finding um, lots of benefits of compassion. Being kind and compassionate towards yourself has lots of well-being benefits for you, but also being kind, gentle, supportive, understanding of other people also benefits you in terms of well-being, not just benefits the recipient of compassion, but also you. And then we also saw that those who experience self-compassion also tend to experience compassion for other people. But that's like an average group level finding. So we began to
Mm,
wonder, is compassion good for everyone? Which form of compassion is good for everyone? Self-compassion or other compassion?
mm.
And then we asked, well, if someone experiences self-compassion, would they also experience other compassion all the time? And this would be true for everyone? Or maybe a self or other compassion, to the extent that it's good for well-being, would it benefit everyone in the same way? And so these are the kinds of questions that we had. And to put it in a slightly more technical terms, we can ask to what extent the average effect, average positive association between self and other compassion observed in the literature, to what extent is that heterogeneous or different in different people? And how does that impact the link of compassion with well-being?
Hetero
Yeah,
heterogeneous. Yeah, that was one word
heterogeneous,
that
that's variable, different for different people.
interesting. Okay, because that was one word that I saw a lot in the paper and that I wondered
Yeah,
about. So what the kind of question to make sure I understand that you're looking at is you have this kind of group level finding from swaths of research on compassion towards oneself and others that it can have these very positive effects for well-being and people's lives. And the question
yeah,
is, well, what are kind of the nuances of this effect when looking at individual people? Is it a very clear effect for the same people, or
absolutely. You got
variance?
it.
Are there differences in dynamics? So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You got it. So we started with the hypotheses that, yeah, we'll at the group level, we'll probably observe this positive association between self-compassion and other compassion. But more importantly for this study, we were interested that the extent to which this would vary or differ in different people, that might have an impact on how compassion is related to their well-being. So we
Wow.
termed this positive association between self and other compassion within a person as self-other harmony in compassion. If the two are harmonious, then we expected that those who experience this harmony in day-to-day life would also experience compassion-related benefits in daily life. And those who have this lack of harmony between self-compassion and other compassion would probably not have the same kind of well-being benefits of compassion in daily life. So these were our hypotheses, and we sought out to test them in an experience sampling method where participants are asked
Can,
six
can,
times a
can I
day for
pause really
40.
quick just to ask something
Yeah,
about something you just said? Yeah.
yeah.
So you're talking about self-compassion, so compassion towards oneself and compassion towards others. And I'm curious to understand, previous research had not looked at this dynamic. They had not looked at, for example, if there's some kind of relationship between self-compassion and other compassion. Is that what you're
They
saying?
had. They had.
Okay.
So the relationship has been studied in the past. It's that people haven't focused on the heterogeneity of the effect. And
Mm,
they usually treat it as an error term to put it in statistical terms. So
mm,
instead of treating it as an error term, we explicitly modeled it. We said that it's an important phenomena, not an error to be just ignored. And
mm,
when you treat it as an important phenomena, then you look at it how it affects compassion linking to well-being, we see meaningful differences between people. That was the idea. So
Interesting.
it has been studied in the past, but in a very different way, and we're building on it and improving it in a way.
Okay, so from
That
what I
makes sense.
understand, when you're looking
Yeah.
at this heterogen
Yeah, heterogeneity.
heterogenic, yeah,
Sure.
where you're taking this kind of lens to this research question, what you're trying to do is, you're not trying to aggregate all of the participants, all the data together to try and find one normative finding, and then everything else is kind of the error around
Oh,
the mean. But what you're
mhm.
trying to do is look at the variations and look at how those variations affect, for example, important variables like well-being, right?
Correct. So, but we are also looking at the aggregate effect.
Mm,
So it's important to look at both individual level effects. What's true for you, for example, what's true for Ben from day-to-day life, and
mm,
what's true for me from day-to-day life. These would be idiographic effects. They are
mm,
specific to a person. But um, to have a science that can inform other people, that can inform clinical practice, we also need some sort of nomothetic or aggregate level understanding of how, when you put Ben and me and many other people together, what does that look like?
mm.
So we need both. We're not saying that having those average level effect or nomothetic effects from past research findings are wrong. They're not wrong. They're incomplete.
Mm.
So average level effects are meaningful. They mean something, but they are
They
designed
give a
for a
part of a
particular
picture.
purpose. They
Yeah.
give you an understanding of uh, an aggregated effect at the population level. But to translate that effect in a clinical setting and inform how you as a clinician, are supposed to interact with an individual client who's just entered and you don't know much about them,
Mm.
it's a bit risky to apply the average effect or the normal effect to
Mm.
that person. That is the point. So
Okay.
we need to advance our methods, and we need to develop a science which we're calling idiomic methods
Mm.
that combine both idiographic insights and nomothetic insights, so we get a more complete picture and we get a different way of looking at the data and different way of looking at people,
It gives a
so
more
we can
kind
better
of,
serve the people
yeah,
that are treated in clinical psychology. Yeah,
it gives a more nuanced perspective on understanding some of these effects that we'll find at group level,
exactly,
right? That's
exactly, and
awesome.
possibly more useful for clinical practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's the
Okay.
idea.
So sorry, I had interrupted you. You were talking about
That's all
experience
right.
sampling methods.
No problem at all. So to test our ideas, we used a study in which we used an experience sampling method where people were asked for about a week. They were asked 6 times a day, certain questions, so 42 time points altogether. And we had transdiagnostic patients, and by that I mean they had a variety of different diagnosed conditions, both physical and mental. And roughly half of them were outpatients, half of them were inpatients. So some of them were actually in hospital. And roughly 50-50 males, females, and a quite broad age range varying from 18 to 64. And then we measured self-compassion, other compassion, and well-being measures of life satisfaction and mood in the moment,
Mm.
and a bunch of contextual variables that we looked at. And then we began by looking at just simple correlations of self-compassion and other compassion separately for each person, within person. And we observed the heterogeneity that we were expecting to see. So for many people, for most people in the data, the association was positive, which is consistent with past nomothetic findings, right? Because nomothetic findings tell you what's true for most people or what's true on average.
Mm.
And that's what we observed. But we
So
also
what was
observed
the
that
you said there was a positive association. Positive association between.
self-compassion and other compassion.
Okay. Okay. So as
So
self-compassion.
within person, yeah, in daily life, the extent to which any given person experienced self-compassion, they also experienced compassion towards others.
Hmm.
So this is what we're calling self-other harmony. So it was in harmony. The two forms of compassion were in harmony for most people. But we also found a substantial number of people for whom there was almost zero association.
Wow.
And then, strikingly, a sizable number of people for whom there was negative association, which meant that the more they experienced
Wow.
self-compassion, the less likely they were to experience compassion towards other. So this is definitely a lack of harmony or discord between the two forms of compassion. So then we began to see, well, okay, so to the extent that this harmony of self and other compassion varies between people, how can that help us understand the links between self-compassion and well-being, and other compassion and well-being? And
Mm.
then, to make the long story short, we did a series of very sophisticated statistical models. They're called multi-level models, in which this within-person association variable was used as a moderator or as something that affects that relationship. So there is, you can imagine that self-compassion is related to well-being, but some other variable is affecting that link. And
Mm.
it's that harmony variable that's affecting that link.
Mm.
So our models helped us test that. And lo and behold,
Ah.
we had consistent, significant interaction effects. That's again a technical term that tells us that there was an interaction with this harmony variable and any given some compassion variable and well-being.
Mm.
So, and this was true even when we accounted for a bunch of contextual effects, the most important thing that they were doing since the last prompt. Did they find it positive? Was it overwhelming? Was it in line with the way they wanted to live, etc.? So we controlled for a whole bunch of other things. And despite those strong controls, we observed this effect that compassion of any form, self or towards others, was linked to well-being, but only when there was self-other harmony.
Hmm.
And for those who lacked this self-other harmony, there was no well-being benefit of compassion.
Wow.
So that's the effect. So it has clear clinical implications that we need to attend to personalized interventions of compassion rather than a one-size-fits-all approach of promoting self-compassion or other compassion for promoting well-being in everybody.
Wow.
It's probably true that for most people, as we observed in the data and as the nomothetic finding tells us, for most people, improving self-compassion or improving other compassion is a good idea. But there's also a cost. If the person who walks into your office lacks that harmony, then you may actually be wasting your time and their
Mm.
time. So for those who lack that harmony, it would be important to first assess their interpretation of self and other compassion,
Mm.
and then work with them to promote that harmony. It's possible that they may have certain false beliefs about what it means to be self-compassionate. They may think that it means being selfish or being self-indulgent or self-pity or being a martyr. And
Yeah.
all of these things are wrong when, objectively, we know that taking care of yourself is a good idea. It improves your well-being, and even better so if it's tied with compassion towards others. So these are specific clinical implications of our results, but there is a broader point here, the broader scientific point that I also wish to convey. And these findings are an example of that broader point. Any psychological process, like self-compassion or compassion towards others, or something else, needs to be viewed in the context of a wider network of processes and not in isolation. So
Mm.
in this paper, the example is you shouldn't be looking at self-compassion on its own. You have to also look at compassion towards others. But you can imagine this can be expanded to include other processes. And
Mm.
that's where the field needs to move. Another point is that individuals in any given sample are not homogeneous with respect to the psychological structures and processes that underlie their observable behavior. This is the psychological heterogeneity that we're talking about, right? And then we also found, and we've been finding it in other studies, some of the recent data that's coming out of our lab as well, that effects that are observed at the group level often fail to apply at the individual level.
Mm.
So in technical terms, it's called the violation of the ergodic assumption. And finally, the final point I want to make, and you can ask me any questions you like after that,
Yeah,
we,
totally.
we need to develop, the field as a whole needs to develop idiomic methods that combine idiographic and idiographic as in person level, individual level,
Mhm.
and nomothetic as in group level or aggregate level insights. We need to combine both. And these kinds of new methods, new ways of looking at data are needed for any research and development for a personalized science of human improvement that's needed so badly.
Mm. Wow. Wow. Okay. First off, applause to you. That was an incredible summary. And yeah, yeah, let's get into question. Yeah. Okay. So firstly, you had talked about some of the kind of implications of this research is that it calls for the need for more personalized interventions, right? And it seems like, and you had also said that, for example, we have to stop making this assumption of homogeneity, right? That like a nomothetic finding will apply very easily, very smoothly to individual people.
Mhm.
I'm curious in taking a more idiomic. I have two questions here, but in taking a more idiomic approach, where
Yeah.
you get to see these different subsets, where you have these different dynamics for people. One person as self-compassion increases, their other compassion decreases,
Uh-huh.
low self-compassion harmony, other person is the opposite, right? So you see these different dynamics. Um, do you think those dynamics in when you take a kind of group look at the different variances, do you think those dynamics will generalize? That, for example, the kind of dynamics you'll see in a research paper will be able to guide a therapist in what kind of categories to look for, what relationships to expect when dealing with an individual person.
That's a great question, Ben. Um, I think there are two things going on there. One is you're wondering whether the kinds of effects that we observed in this study would be replicated in other research. And that remains to be seen. We had a clinical sample, so we need future research to see if this would replicate in other kinds of sample. Um, but I'm willing to bet that no matter what sample, what country, what age group, we are likely to observe heterogeneity because that
Mm,
seems to be popping everywhere we look. It's just that as a scientific community, we haven't been looking at it as carefully as we've just started to do
mm,
recently, although there have been calls to do so for quite some time in the
mm,
literature. So I think there will, as more and more data comes out where we show this kind of heterogeneity, more people will pay attention to it and it will have consequences. The other part of your question, I believe, is how can information of this nature inform clinical decisions in the moment?
in navigating that
That's
heterogeneity. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and that's $1 million question. And then lots of people, including us in our group, in our research group, in our lab, we are working in that area. And I can tell you that one way to consider is we would need information, within person information from a particular person or a client coming in to be able to understand them in a more comprehensive way about different processes that are relevant for them.
Mm,
So we already know from the literature, 50 something years of research in psychology, how important certain processes are, at least at the group level. So the group level or nomothetic insights aren't completely useful. They are telling us that for at least some people or a lot of people, certain processes work in improving their well-being. And based on that knowledge, we can start there and we can start to assess a particular person. But there's no guarantee that those average effects will work for this client coming in. So we
mm,
have to find out. So we have to be more data driven as much as possible. So get that information. And then we, along with others, are developing these highly sophisticated tools that can extract these idiomic insights from that kind of data fairly
mm,
quickly. And we're using a variety of different methods, including these advanced statistical tools and machine learning methods that can help us understand that, okay, out of a dozen or so processes, let's say, which ones are important for Ben
Mm,
as Ben is coming in. And it's not that they're important for Ben all the time, forever. And because there is this personality called Ben, we don't want to see it that way. It's more like right now, as Ben is presenting, given his unique life history and his current circumstances, which processes are fueling his ill being and which processes seem relevant for his well being.
mm,
So it's a network of processes
yeah.
for Ben that are important for Ben. It would be Ben's fingerprint, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, of his psychological processes.
Yeah.
And once we get a bit of understanding of that, and then there could be a conversation between the therapist and Ben about, okay, looks like process A, B, C are leading towards certain problems for you,
Mm,
sadness, perhaps anxiety, and then other kinds of processes that we can also identify, and they're coming up as really important. That seems to be promoting good things in your life. What do you think about that? Like, how do we invest more in these processes that seem to be promoting your well-being? And that could be a starting point of a conversation.
mm,
And then if it's done in a transparent manner, it would give Ben a lot of autonomy and a lot of power over his own life and his own condition and choice. And Ben would have choice. Okay, looks like process 1, 2, 3 are really important. I'm going to try number 3 first.
mm.
And then maybe I'll come back to number 1 later if that doesn't work or something. But
Absolutely.
at least you get a more informed way of proceeding and a way that's both informed by nomothetic findings of past literature, but they're personalized and applied to you.
Yeah. And I think that
Does that
that's
make
kind
sense?
of a fundamental kind of dilemma that therapists and clinicians are thrown into, where they're needing to rely on evidence-based concepts and theories and findings that are
Right.
generalized at the nomothetic effect or nomothetic level. But
Yeah.
at the same time, they're in dance with an individual person, recognizing that everybody is different, right? And so they're trying to figure out, how do I individualize this
Yeah.
treatment? How do I make this treatment relevant for just this person? You mentioned this kind of necessity to look at processes in a network, right?
Yeah.
So not just looking at self-compassion, but what this research might, elucidate is that looking at the relationship between self-compassion and other compassion can be a really relevant point.
And
For,
possibly expanding to other variables in future. You might include mindfulness in it. You
mm,
might include acceptance in it, for just to give you a couple of examples,
yeah,
or a few other processes that past research has shown are supporting these processes. And then we might want to look at a comprehensive network of how they are operating for a particular person.
yeah. So I guess the question though is that, from your understanding of some of the process-based literature that's coming out now, and looking at this idiomic question, right? These
Yeah,
idiomic research methods, do you think that with these methods, we can help individual clinicians navigate this heterogeneity? Because
absolutely. That
it, well,
absolutely. That
yeah.
is that is the plan.
So then the question
Absolutely.
is that how can we use some of this research to guide our, like, well, I guess the question is can we use some of the research that we're talking about here to guide like which processes we might look at? Because, for example, it seems like there's a huge number of processes that one could look
Mhm.
at, right? It depends on your theoretical orientation or therapy that you're using,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and given that there's such, what you're showing is that, and other researchers as well are showing that there's such large heterogeneity, it
Mhm.
kind of seems like there's this huge focus on the therapist needing to do the research, right? Needing to do the researcher's job in collecting the data and figuring out what.
Yeah, I think we need a team effort. So people who are full-time researchers, such as myself and some of my colleagues, we are working quite closely with others who are clinicians. So
Mm,
you need a team. You cannot expect one clinician to solve all the problems.
mm,
And they need to be empowered with these methods, and they need to be empowered with user-friendly tools that
mm,
can help them efficiently gather the required data and efficiently generate insights from the
mm,
gathered. But what happens behind the scenes or under the hood in terms of the algorithms that are used to generate those insights? It's people like me who can work on those things and solve those problems. So I think we as a community need to solve. One person may not have all the right
Yeah,
pieces to solve this, but as a community, we're far more powerful than any single individual. And I
absolutely.
think that's where the field is headed. And we are working in close collaboration with clinicians. And we have to be in this continual, by we, I mean researchers who are full-time devoted to this. We need to be in continuous conversation with them, and we need to ask them, okay, here's a tool, here's an algorithm that tells us this. What do you think about that? How would that affect your conversation with the client? And they might say, okay, this is too complicated. Maybe we need to simplify it in this way or that way. Or, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, but it won't work for everyone. And so
Mhm.
it's that back and forth conversation that has this potential of improving. This is work in development. Many of the technical problems have been solved, but some still remain and will be solved in coming months and years. We are seeing this really exciting wave of change. We're in the midst of, I would say, a paradigm shift that's happening. It's
Mm.
very exciting. So the kinds of problems that you are identifying have existed for quite some time. And clinicians have been kind of left to fend for themselves and rely largely on their intuition or sort of their best judgment.
Mm.
And sometimes, some clinicians that I've talked to have told me they sometimes feel guilty that when they face a client, they think their own clinical intuition tells them that they need to deviate from the RCT, so-called evidence-based recommendation, and do something different with this person because that so-called evidence-based recommendation isn't working for them. But
Mm.
they feel a bit of uh, guilt going as if they're doing something wrong, but they're
Mm.
not. They're honoring the needs of the person in front of them and doing something to improve their lives. And what we're trying to do is to, empower them more by saying how their clinical judgment can be more in line with empirical data
Yeah, it can be
that's
honed in an empirical way. Yeah.
correct. Does that
You
make
know,
sense?
absolutely. Yeah. I guess I'm wondering, and I've heard this before, and I guess I'm curious how that I'm curious if you have more practical or like not practical, but concrete examples, not practical, but
Okay.
so that I can get an understanding of. So, for example, you had mentioned that you aren't connected with clinicians and that there's this kind of teamwork effort, right, between researchers and people doing work on, I guess, like with feet on the ground, what's the metaphor for it, whatever it is, right,
Yeah.
or
Oh,
people who
yeah.
are actually doing the work. And I'm curious, first off, is through what means are researchers and clinicians meeting? Is this in conferences? Is this because of a nonprofit effort, or what is the kind of context that's gathering researchers and clinicians together for at least you personally? And in regards of that context, firstly, how do you see this? What are kind of some of the positive impacts that you're seeing about this kind of teamwork effort, and where do you think that this teamwork effort is really lacking or is needs to be improved?
Yeah, great question. I mean, for me personally, I am working with my both research colleagues and clinician colleagues here in Australian Catholic University. So that's my
Mm.
immediate environment. So there may be people who are, for people who want to do this kind of collaborative work, if you're a researcher or a clinician, I think it's useful to just, sometimes things are right underneath our nose and we don't even realize it.
Mhm.
So it's often useful to look in our immediate organization, social environment of where we can find these potentially useful collaborations. So I have those with a number of my colleagues, and we are co-authors, including on this paper. Um, but also more internationally, it's important to reach out to like-minded people who have made an important contribution to the field, who are open to these ideas, who are skilled, or who have complementary skills that you may not have. So I've been working with both this not-for-profit organization, Institute for Better Health, IBH. You mentioned you'll be speaking with Steve soon, and he's the president of that
Mhm.
organization.
Absolutely.
I've been working with Steve and others on these number of papers that are coming out in this area. So it's been great. It's been quite useful. We have colleagues in Germany and Switzerland that we are collaborating with. So it is a worldwide effort. And as I mentioned earlier, there is like a paradigm shift happening in the field, and there's sufficient momentum that
Mm,
this is going to happen. And then it's only a matter of time because a lot of important people, a lot of dedicated, smart people are devoting a lot of time to
mm,
solving problems. So this is going to happen. Um, in terms of the other part of your question, where this might not be happening, I'm not a practitioner, so I'm not linked to broader practitioner conferences or communities in that way. So I personally cannot answer that question very well. But I think as researchers, I can answer from the researcher point of view. I have more
Well,
experience.
can I
Yeah.
rephrase the question real quick? It's
Sure.
I'm curious about the teamwork effort between process-based therapy researchers and clinicians who hope to practice process take a process-based approach when practicing
Okay.
therapy. And I'm curious, where do you think researchers that connection between researchers and clinicians, where do you think that's really strong and you guys are doing really good work together in you know kind of providing this science and providing this treatment, and where do you think that kind of relationship between clinicians and researchers is lacking? And in what area do you think we can use improvement?
Well, I suppose in general terms, I can say that clinicians who aren't engaging with latest research would be dissociated with it, and that's maybe too simple an answer. But I can tell you that this paper that we discussed on self-compassion and other compassion and their links to with well-being is a really good example of how this kind of collaboration can be quite useful for clinicians. So some of the co-authors on that paper are clinicians.
Mm,
So Madeline Fraser is compassion-based clinician, and my collaboration with her on this paper has quite directly influenced her own style of compassion-based intervention, she tells me.
mm,
So that's an example of how doing this sort of research, idiomic research, can directly impact clinical practice. Now, of
mm,
course, it's clinical practice is more complicated and more comprehensive than self-compassion alone. I
mm.
acknowledge that. And
Absolutely.
that's why we said that it's important to look at a wider network of processes and not just one thing like self-compassion. But I think this particular project that we worked on is a good example of how when clinicians or empirical clinicians and researchers, when they come together, something really useful, beautiful, something with great clinical utility, but also scientific utility can come out of it.
Mm, interesting. I'd be very curious to talk to that colleague or just ask that colleague
Sure.
what were some of kind of the implications of, or how they had changed
Mm.
how they had showed up in therapy. Um, I wanted to go back to the paper. You said what was the time that you needed to head off actually again? So
In about 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, this will be my last question. Um,
Well, actually 10. I can have 10. Yeah.
okay. Um, yeah, so you had I guess I'll ask a smaller one first. You had talked about how the nomothetic effect of, you know, this kind of compassion, self-other harmony applied for most people. There was a lot of heterogeneity, but the nomothetic finding applied to the majority of people, right? Um,
Uh-huh.
I'm curious, do you have some understanding of kind of the size of the demographics where people fell on the kind of more positive side of the relationship between self and other compassion? Like, was that like, well, yeah, maybe
That's
percentages or
interesting. Yeah.
fractions?
In the data at hand, the data that I looked at, there weren't age effects or effects of whether you're in the hospital or whether you're an outpatient, for example. We didn't observe them in this data. That's not to say they don't exist. It's just that right now we don't have any evidence that they do. And by that, what I'm saying is that this sort of heterogeneity will exist whether you're a young person looking at a sample of young
Hmm.
people, or looking at a sample of older people, or looking at a sample of those who are inpatient uh, um, uh, patients residing in a hospital context, or outpatient, or don't have any diagnosed clinical conditions but are members of the general community. As far as I can tell. But I can tell you that there are other studies that have been done in which, for example, mindfulness practitioners tend to have greater self-other harmony and compassion than others. So
Mm.
there may be subgroups in the population, and because they've sort of maybe deliberately cultivated this harmony in their practice, where you would see perhaps less heterogeneity if you only looked at those samples.
Yeah. So I'm curious in terms of like the size of, because I'm from my understanding, there's kind of three categories where people will have a strong positive relationship between self-compassion and other compassion. They'll have this like neutral relationship, or have this like negative relationship. And I'm curious, like, if the positive relationship was much bigger than the neutral group, was it because it was like 80%, 10%, 10%, or
Okay, so I need to make a more broader point to contextualize this
okay.
question. I think it would be a mistake to make these very strong categories of people saying, "Oh, you
Mm,
belong to lack of self-harmony group," or "You belong to the harmony group."
okay.
That has this effect of I love this term, that has this effect of reifying, or making that which is actually ephemeral and subject to change, making that into something solid or permanent.
Mm,
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. So these processes are dynamic processes in a constant flux,
mm,
which means that they're not a thing that you can capture and store it in storage and it'll stay like that forever.
mm,
It's subject to change. It's related with many other things. And if that's the case, if it's a dynamic system, you cannot say that, okay, Ben, you are X, you lack self-harmony, and that's that. And we have to treat you
mm.
that way.
Well,
It doesn't
if
mean that way. It means more that right now, in this complex of processes that Ben is experiencing, this is a pattern of behavior.
mm. Well,
But
is
this pattern is a dynamic, is subject to change. Hence, we need to understand the different levers in it, that if we intervene on those levers, we might influence the change in a positive direction.
mm, hmm,
Which means it would be a mistake to kind of divide the population into saying, oh, that's a subgroup of high harmony people or low harmony people. Even high harmony people, so to speak, will have experiences or moments in their life where they won't have that harmony, because the very nature of self and other harmony is dependent on many other processes in a network of
I think
processes.
it's in the nature though of all of psychology to kind of make this
That is correct.
reification error,
You're
right?
absolutely
Like,
right. So
yeah.
reification is a widespread problem in psychology, but and my points about not reifying apply to everything in psychology.
Wait, let me understand. So you're saying reification is a widespread problem in psychology, but from my understanding, how you described it is it's implicit to the methods of psychology that to
It is, but that's not how people think about it. People discover certain
oh,
effects in their statistical models, and they might affect an average effect, for example. It has this psychological effect on researchers and even clinicians that these nomothetic effects are reified. There's this, it's kind of happened often implicitly. It's people often aren't realizing. I'm not saying everyone is oblivious to
so
it.
it's kind of this
Uh,
recognition that like, I mean, science is based, this is the fundamental tenet of science is empiricism, and that the empiricism is that we rely on in psychology of psychological experience is a kind of evidence that is ambiguous at times or dynamic at times, or it's very, very nuanced and
I
very
would say it's dynamic all the time,
yeah.
because we are dealing
Mm,
with live human beings. We are not dealing with unchanging solid objects or something like that. And human beings are subject to change. The psychological processes within them are subject to change to the extent that they are dependent on a lot of different things. They're dependent on the person's physiological conditions, their context, their social context, a wider context in society, political context, so on and so forth. There are multiple levels of influences that are happening on any given person's psychological network, if I can
Mm,
describe it that way. And if that's the case, it would be a mistake to reify anything
mm,
within the psychological experiences of that person. Even the experience of self-compassion in the moment, it's an ephemeral experience. It will come and it will go.
mm,
And it's dependent on certain conditions that are arising that's giving rise to that experience.
hmm. We could keep going with this. This is
We
really
can, can't
fascinating.
we? Yeah.
Uh, but oh my gosh,
I hope that's enough food for thought for now.
yeah, thank you so much for this. This is absolutely
You're
fascinating.
most welcome. You're
Yeah.
most welcome. I'm very pleased to see a young person taking such great interest in these matters
Yeah.
and doing your part to spread these kinds of messages amongst your peers and others. So good on you. Well done, Ben.
Well, hopefully, if I can get good enough at this, then the what's reinforcing about this for me is I love having kind of intellectual conversations like this. I just find it absolutely fascinating, and I think what might be a more broadly beneficial kind of outcome of this is
Yes.
hopefully that that teamwork effect you talked about, that relationship between
Absolutely.
researchers and clinicians.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Maybe I can be a small little nudge in helping develop that for the better.
that
So.
would be fantastic. That would be fantastic.
Well, I couldn't do it if it wasn't for you who and people like you who are willing to talk with me and talk about this. So thank you so much,
You're
Balvin.
welcome, Ben.
And yeah, this is awesome.